Welcome to Ranting and Raving. This is obviously a non-Saints video, so if you're here for Saints content, you probably noticed from the image and the title, not that video. Here on the channel, we talk about a bunch of different topics. We talk basketball, probably about 70% Saints, but video games, anime, sports, a lot of stuff is going to get talked about. And today, I'm going to be having a little bit of fun here, and I'm going to rank at least the numbered games from my favorite video game franchise, which is Final Fantasy. So as you can see here, we do have an honorable mention. There are actually two honorable mentions. So there are two numbered mainline Final Fantasy games that I will not be ranking. That is Final Fantasy 11 and Final Fantasy 14. Those are for what I hope are obvious reasons. They're both MMOs. They're both okay. 14 is a great game. Final Fantasy 14 is probably the best MMO that's out right now. Yeah, pretty much end to end. Like it's amazing. If you're into those types of games, it's fantastic. It's in an incredible place. And if you know the history of it and how it started, that's pretty impressive. Funny enough, the guys that actually turned the game around are the team that made Final Fantasy 11. They actually brought them in to fix 14, which is how Realm Reborn came around, and a disaster of a release became a great game. Final Fantasy 11 is not a great game. Final Fantasy 11 is one of those rare games that's a bad game and yet is incredibly addicting and really fun to play, even though it's a bad game. It is not a well-balanced game. It was super, super restrictive and punishing for solo players. It was much more popular in Japan than it was in the West, but I still loved it. My brother loved it. A bunch of my friends loved it. It was a good game, but again, not on the list. So this list, I am with a couple of exceptions, and I'll make those clear. This is not an objective ranking. I'm not purely looking from a game design, mechanics, balancing, storytelling, graphics, relative to error, blah 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 blah. This is my ranking of my favorite video game franchise for fun. So a few of these are completely biased, but these are all my opinions and I have reasons for them, and we're going to go over them. But I do want to get that out of the way. And if you guys have played these games and you don't agree with where I rank things, have some fun. Go down in the comments. Tell me where you would have placed things, and tell me why. Let's have some fun with this. Comments are always welcome on the channel, as long as you're not being okay, I was going to say if you're not being a jackass, but really I can be one. So if you're not being a jackass and it wasn't instigated, probably by me. So let's be real here. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started with the list. We're going to start at the worst games in the franchise history, and we're going to work our way all the way up to what I think is the best mainline Final Fantasy game in the franchise's history. So the worst game they have ever made. And if you're looking at the screen going, Brian, why do I see a Korean boy band? Well, because that's basically it's a Korean boy band goes on an extended camping trip and then sort of tries to save the kingdom / world. That is basically this game. The internet memeified the hell out of it, and normally that's something I'd kind of push back against, at least, and like, okay, it's not really that bad. It's really that bad. Poorly balanced. It's not entirely their fault. This game was originally supposed to be 13 Verses, which was a spinoff roughly within the Final Fantasy 13 universe, and it got changed and recommissioned and redone and restarted half a dozen times, and it showed in the final product. It did a few things. It had a bunch of really interesting things. It should have been a good game. The graphics are great. It had some interesting stuff. The teleporting mechanic with Noxus was a lot of fun. Here's the problem. The damage scaling and the scaling in general was bad. The team members' AI is trash, like legitimately trash. Even once they released patches later, it was still trash. The damage and difficulty ramps are bad. It's grindy and not in a good way. It's not really that fun to play, even though it has this really kinetic, what should be fun, almost Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, Ryzen Revenge like type game of like just this kinetic, frenetic style. It, but it's trash. It's terrible, and the story's meh. And especially with Final Fantasy games, like it's a JRPG. It like you're partially here for the fun of the gameplay, and especially a lot of the stuff is especially in Final Fantasy, most of it is turn-based battle with some of the later installments doing other things to varying degrees of success. You're here for the story. The story, the setting, the characters, that's what makes the game is interesting and fun. The other things are the cherry on top, and they do make a huge difference. But the fact that this is so just poorly executed in so many different ways, and then the story's meh on top of it, worst game in the franchise. I honestly believe, if we were looking at it from a purely objective standpoint, 15, and I will tell you the other game that has a contention for the worst numbered game in the series history, which we'll get to here in a minute. Those two games are fighting for it, but there's actually a game that comes between them for me, my list, and there are probably obnoxious clown obsessed fanboys in certain Reddit boards that are ready to wring my neck right now, and that's fine. I would be dishonest if I didn't say that at least 20% of this being where it is on the list is me being just so tired of just massive exaggeration of how good this game is, because it has a mildly interesting villain, and he's mildly interesting mostly because he kind of sort of wins. It's not a good game. I have actually beaten every single I've beaten almost every Final Fantasy game that's out there, like period, with like 3 exceptions. Like you can't beat MMOs, but I've played both of them quite extensively. Like I never fully beat Tactics because I just didn't enjoy the combat system. I never played Crystal Chronicles; it doesn't exist. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 other like fringe games that I haven't played, but like I've played and beat pretty much all of them. Like I said, they're my favorite games. 6 is the only game in the series, other than 15, which I also just rage quit because 15 was trash. 6, it wasn't the gameplay that was trash or the other stuff. It was, I got about 8 hours into the game and was so bored and so disinterested in literally everything going on. And keep in mind, I love these games. Like it was meh, just a giant ball of meh. I hated the game. I hated the characters. I didn't like anything about it. I didn't think it was good. I didn't think it was interesting. And if a game can't grab you without after 8 hours of gameplay, it's not for you. So 15 I feel is objectively the worst game, so I did put it behind it, but this is my least favorite Final Fantasy by far. And worst and least favorite are not the same thing, as we will talk about at the end. Best and favorite are also not the same thing. And here is our other contender for objectively the worst game. If the Zodiac Age re-release didn't exist, Final Fantasy 12 would be the worst game. It would be it last, then 15, then 6. Zodiac Age does exist, and it does it rebalances and improves the game enough from a playability standpoint and accessibility standpoint, that I don't have it dead last. But Final Fantasy 12, they tried to do a ton of new things, and tried to mix them with some old things that they had a lot of success with previously, and none of them worked well. Vaughn and Pinello are faceless, personalityless, useless automata that are just in the game as placeholders, and they're the first 2 characters you meet. And it's okay to have the story kind of sort of told from the perspective of a character who's actually, the sidekick. There's another very, very highly ranked game on this list where the main character is not the character from whose perspective the story is told. And that game is executed extremely well, partially because the characters whose perspective you're playing from are meaningful to the plot and well built and established as characters. Whether you like the character or not, they're well written, built, and established. These characters aren't. On top of that, the battle system is terrible. I hate the gambit system. It's awful. It's unwieldy. It's like you literally can auto play boss battles. It's just it sucks. It's not good. They were trying to do something new and be innovative, which has always been a big thing for them, but none of it hit it on the head. Like I said, the Zodiac Age re-release was better. Like, it's playable as a game. I have beaten it, but not good. Next on the list is the original. So Final Fantasy 1 comes in at number 10, not because it's not a good game. This is literally the game that saved Square as a company. That's why it's called Final Fantasy. It was literally their last game. Like, hey, if this doesn't do well, we're closing as a studio. And then it did incredibly well and started arguably, one of the 3 or 4 biggest franchises in the history of gaming. That's a whole nother video and discussion, but like, the Final Fantasy franchise is huge, folks, huge. And it made Square a huge company, Squaresoft, Square Enix, all of that. But Final Fantasy 1 is number 10 on the list, not because it's a bad game, it's because it's the original, and as you would expect, later games were just better. There may be some people from a nostalgia perspective prefer it. I don't. I've beaten 1, I've beaten 2, and I've beaten 3, and I have those at 10, 9, and 8, not because they're not good games. And they are in sequential order, which most of this list isn't, simply because they did build on each other. They were good games. They were solid. They were worth playing, but they're not great relative to a number of the other games on this list. So they're good games. They're obviously, influential, but we're not going to spend any more time on them. So the next game on the list here, and this is probably the last one. This might even be the only one I don't have a super strong opinion on. I could have put this at 10 and then gone 1, 2, 3, or I could leave it where it was. Not because I don't think it's a good game. It just didn't really leave didn't leave a huge lasting impression on me for whatever reason. But Final Fantasy V is a good game. I kind of like it where it is. It's right in the middle of the list. It's not great. It's not bad. It's solid. And for me, that's where 5 was. I'm sure there's people out there who disagree, and the game hit them harder than it hit me, and that's fine. That's where I have it ranked. And then the next number on the list, and there are absolutely people out there that would put this dead last. Number 1, they would be wrong. Like, objectively, this isn't the worst game. This is the first Final Fantasy game I ever played. It's actually the first non-Pokemon video game I ever owned and played. So there's a huge nostalgic factor. Like, from a nostalgia perspective, this would be number 2 on this list. If I was factoring nostalgia in here and it was just what's my favorite, I've beaten this game 24 times at least. And replay is not something that I'm able to do a ton. So that kind of tells you, all 3 discs, and people who've played the game will understand the joke there, and people who haven't, you'll get over it. Ask a friend. But all three, yes, there's 4. All 3 discs and the DLC, Final Fantasy 8. It's really, really interesting. So I like 8. I thought it was well written. I thought it was interesting from a narrative, from a story standpoint. They did some cool things. They did some things that were a little contrived, but it's fantasy. Like, it's in the title. Like, that's part of it. That's fine. There's things like that in games that come later in the list too. It's okay. But the thing that I think is the most interesting, and it's a big part of why 8 is as high on this list as it is, where, again, it wouldn't be as high for some others, is it did one really innovative thing that I don't think, and maybe it's just because I'm so analytical in the way that I look at things, other people notice as much. Final Fantasy 8 actually went completely first of all, most players play this game wrong. The way you're actually supposed to play 8 is as a low level run. There are strategies to actually not level your characters up, because all of the enemies in the game, including bosses, level is determined by a ratio of basically an average of your character's levels. So if your whole party level is average level is 18, the boss is level 18. And the boss means it has level 18 stats. Well, here's the thing. There's this junction system where you can take magic, which by the way, you can get from the card game and you can draw from enemies. So you can get all the best, you can get Ultima, you can get all the best spells in the game. You can junction those to your stats. So your characters can actually be at very, very low levels and have max stats. And it makes the game a breeze. Now, do I play that way? No, I do what I'm not supposed to do, and I power level everything because that's part of what I enjoy doing. And fuck it, I don't care. It's my game. I'm playing it the way I want. But I do think that's the junction system I really like, and I've always found interesting. And I really like that you have the option to play the game the way you want, but also just from a development standpoint, it's really interesting to take a genre where you're preconditioned to get to the highest level, get the best gear, get the best stats as quickly as possible. And you're actually not supposed to do that. They completely invalidated levels as a thing in this game. So I have it at number 6. Number 5 is if putting Final Fantasy VI as my second worst Final Fantasy game of all time, putting 13 as my number 5 is probably if my number 1 pick isn't the most controversial, which it would be for some fans of the series and not for others. Having this high probably would be the most controversial thing on here. But I really enjoyed 13. 13.2 is one of the most fun games I've ever played. Like I loved 13.2. 13.3 was fun, but it wasn't incredible. But just the 13 series, it actually tells a really good story. It's really well developed. Lightning is a fantastic character. Very well written. In a genre and just gaming in general, but in a genre where strong female characters are the exception and not the norm, having an actual female main character was a meaningful thing. And the fact that Lightning's a fucking badass on top of that, um, really the train intro scene from the trailer and everything, chef's kiss, amazing cutscene, fucking awesome. But I actually really enjoyed the battle system in this game. I thought it was a great balance between kind of a more frenetic action type thing, but really still had all the core elements of a turn-based system that I've always enjoyed. But it felt faster, but not so fast where it would overwhelm you. I thought it was really, really well designed. I loved the paradigm system. I actually enjoyed the story, but I will acknowledge that this is not the most accessible game that they've made, especially from a storytelling standpoint. This is very Tolkien-esque. They're speaking Elvish or Trekkie, if you prefer that. They're speaking Klingon, like the Lissi, Falsi. It's not only that it created its own universe, which is great. World building is important, but doubled and tripled and quadrupled down into sniffing its own glue and forcing you to overindulge in the mythos of the world. It could be a little heavy for players. Anybody who's complaining about the linearity, shut up. It's a stupid complaint. It's always been a stupid complaint. The number 1 game on this list is probably the most linear game in the entire franchise. 7's the most iconic game in the franchise. It's linear as hell. If you don't think it's linear as hell, really try to go somewhere you're not allowed to go yet. And there'll be a plot device that makes it so you can't go there. It's linear. It just hides it better. The difference is this game doesn't do as good of a job of establishing the setting and the characters as early as the other games do, so the linearity feels more impactful. But that's a deep dive. We're not going to go that deep into it. But Final Fantasy 13 is number 5. Number 4, and ironically, it is number 4. If the number 1 on this list is my favorite game of the series, and I think objectively is the best Final Fantasy game from a game design, game development standpoint, as well as being my favorite. Number 4 is probably my second favorite. Final Fantasy 4 is criminally underrated. I think that the storytelling in this game, the arc of the stories, the way it was written, the way it was set up is fantastic. Cecil's storyline, the ebbs and the flows, the highs and the lows, the interplay with Kane, everything, the way it was developed in this story is really good fantasy storytelling. I thought it was I really honestly thought it was fantastic. If you haven't played Final Fantasy IV, look up an emulator, get a 3DS, which it was re-released on, figure it out. I highly, highly, highly recommend playing this game. Really well told story. Yes, it's tropey. All fantasy is tropey. All good fantasy is even more tropey. But it's very human. It's very well written. I enjoyed it. I really, really enjoyed it. That's why it's number 4 on the list. And those who are keeping track already know who the top 3 are. So it's just a question of in what order do they fall. And some of you, probably many of you, all 4 of you who will watch this video are going to be peeved because number 3 is the number 1 seed who you thought was going to win the championship, but they're out in the second round. It's Final Fantasy VII. And this, and I'm putting the remake graphic up here because the remake is the most recent release in this franchise at this point, and it is a franchise between Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, Advent Children, Final Fantasy VII Original, and now the remake, which will probably be a trilogy. It's a damn franchise. I've played them all, I beat them all, I've watched them all, I've enjoyed them all. I love Final Fantasy VII. I don't think it's the best game. It's the most famous game. Especially just because of Sephiroth alone. He's an edgy boy, and we like him. And Cloud is Cloud, and he's famous character, and it's the most famous story. And I get all that, and I'm not denying any of it. And 7 really was the game that brought the JRPG genre to the West in a mainstream capacity. And I have it as the 3rd greatest in the franchise. So clearly, it's right up there for me. And I honestly, I could swap 2 and 3 and not have any issue with it at all. The reason I have the second one over the first is partially because I really don't think that game gets its due at all. 4 and 2 on the list, which we'll talk about in a second, are without question to me the 2 most underappreciated and underacknowledged games in the franchise. 7 gets probably a bit more love than it needs, but it definitely gets as much love as it needs. It's a fantastic game, especially when you look at the franchise as a whole, all of the entities. I mean, really, if we were considering all the entities, Advent Children alone puts 7 at the top. That's a legitimately good movie, and it's like just a giant cutscene for a video game. But number 2 is Final Fantasy IX. And I have this as number 2. Again, I could swap this in 7, but I do have it this as number 2, in part because it is such an underappreciated game, but also because it's maybe the most adult story that is told in this is a game of tragedy. Oh my God, Vivi's story is tragic. Dagger's story is tragic, especially the interactions with Queen Braum, the Mad Queen. Zidane's story, especially as that unravels in the later parts of the final disc, that's tragic. Aiko is oh yeah, she's lovable and adorable and bouncy. Yeah, no, she's a completely mind-broken 6-year-old who has been through some major shit and is kind of gone cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs as a coping mechanism. Freya sees her fucking world almost literally get destroyed. Really, the only character, even Quino, who's just a fucking joke extra character, has a little bit of tragedy, but just too dumb to realize it. All of these characters, this is a story of overcoming and surviving tragedy. I loved this game when I played it when I was young. When I've replayed it as an adult, I love it 100 times more. It's a great, great story. It's a really well balanced game. It's really, really well put together. This is a chef's kiss of a fantasy story in video game form, and it's definitely, to me, the most underappreciated game in the series. And it does an amazing job of, with all the tragedy, blending in enough humor to make you laugh, make you roll your eyes, but then also tells, like I said, a really dark, painful story for a lot of these characters, but they all overcome it, which tropey, but excellent. And for those who are keeping track, there's only one game missing. So who is number 1? goes without saying. So I will say this, and I really do mean this. I believe objectively there will be a separate video specifically about this, because this one is going to get a deep dive, partially because it's my favorite, but and I run the channel, but partially because it takes a longer explanation. But objectively, this is the best game in the series to me. Best doesn't mean favorite. You can have a different favorite and something can be the best. From the battle system to the sphere grid, especially once you get into the international version, which even took it to the next level, made it even better. The story writing, the pacing, the script, the different characters. Blitzball is a mini game, best mini game in a Final Fantasy game by miles and miles and miles. Low bar, but still like really good. I literally have a save where I go in to play Blitzball when I'm bored. Like I loved it. I can only say two negative things about this game. Tidus's voice actor in the American Western release, obviously the only version I've played because me be white boy and me no speak Japanese. And I'm not gonna try. My brother speaks a bit. I don't. Yeah, we be weebs. His voice actor and that one scene that if you've played the game, you know exactly what scene I'm talking about. And if you haven't played the game, don't worry, I'm not gonna fucking scar you. But literally, other than that, this is as close as you can get to a perfect RPG. Everything I had to say about 9 as far as telling a story of tragedy and suffering is in this game. Self-sacrifice, and what I mentioned before about what 12 does poorly, 10 does brilliantly. The game literally starts with Tidus telling you, "This is my story." But here's the thing: it is his story, but it's his story about how he participated in the actual main character of the story, Yuna. Yuna is the main character of this game. Yuna is the antagonist. It's Yuna's journey. It's Yuna's quest. It's Yuna's story. And it's told through Tidus's eyes and from Tidus's perspective. But what makes that work is that while it's Yuna's story, Tidus is the catalyst. Some people's going to correct me to Titus, and I don't care. He's the catalyst that makes a lot of the other pieces fall in place. So he has many of the attributes of a main character, but narratively, it is Yuna's story. And it's a brilliantly done balance between those characters. It's their story together. The tragedy of Spira, the spiral of death, that story, the story, the story of Seymour, the story of Yuna, the endless cycle of pain and death and destruction, the literal wiping out of an entire village of people 2 hours into the game, and then this 16-year-old girl has to go send their souls into the afterlife, bearing weight that she's in no way ready to handle. It's really impressive. And like I said, the battle system is excellent. This is the pinnacle of turn-based combat. The sphere grid is excellent. It's restrictive but well guided early, to mid game, and then late game it's totally open and you can build your characters in any way you want, or literally max out the sphere grid and just have a party of unstoppable monsters in order to beat the monster arena. Or you can get first strike on a 1 for Yuna, get Yojimbo, max out his secret friend rating, one shot everything, and cheese that motherfucker. Hey, whatever works. Have I done both? I've done both. But this is without question the number one game for me. So like I said before, if you guys disagree, or even if you agree, feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section. We always welcome comments around here. Hope you enjoyed the content. And if you're a Saints fan and you stuck it out through this, I double appreciate you. And don't worry, there's going to be lots of Saints content coming. But there are going to be these occasional videos that are just fun for me, and I'm going to have a good time with. So hope you guys enjoy this, and you'll hear from me again soon.